This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
There's one really big player in the guitar plugin space, and it's Neural DSP. They seem to have quite deep pockets in terms of paying folks like me, not me, but other folks that are on YouTube or on Instagram. I think this is a good thing for those players and those guitarists. I think it's good to see a company that is kind of more forward thinking in terms of also collaborating with artists, and also it's good to see them kind of working with guitarists that are actually helping them grow the company, you know, whether it's people like Jack Gardner, Tom Quayle, you know, the normal sorts of folks, Joshua Della Victoria. There's a guy on Instagram called Baxty. I think basically they do pay some folks to just use their plugins and create posts with them, and I think that is kind of refreshing in a world where typically in the plugin space I get emails from people like Mercurial or STL or folks like that that are just like, I'll give you a free license if you create a video, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, that didn't cost you anything. So there's some positive sides to what Neural DSP are doing, as well as I think a lot of folks have been turned on to the idea of, you know, maybe you don't need a modeler, maybe you just need your interface and a computer to get some really interesting fun tones and stuff. The slight downside with, I think, some of the neural stuff is that there's been, over the years, I think there's 16 or 17 plugins now, and there is starting to be these kind of overlaps, you know, in terms of the things that they've covered quite a lot of times, you know, whether it's a tube screamer or it's a 5150 style amp or two 5150 style amps or JCM 800 style amps, or you know, similar reverbs and delays, or maybe even the same reverbs and delays across lots of them. Once you own a couple of Neural DSP plugins, I think maybe it's worth looking outside of Neural for alternatives, and so that's basically what this video is about. So for me, what I'm looking for with, you know, making purchases for plugins is things that do different things to one another, whereas, you know, if you buy 2-3 Neural DSP plugins, they tend to then start to overlap, and you get sort of like a diminishing returns kind of thing going on. So that's kind of the idea of this video. It's not necessarily just bagging on Neural DSP for the sake of it, but it's also trying to find things that are outside of that that are worth thinking about. I think, first of all, in the free space, there are some really interesting things. So you'll have heard of Neural Amp Modeler. This is, you know, still relatively new, but Stephen Atkinson came out with this kind of free version, more or less, of the Quad Cortex type capture thing. And there are some really interesting sounds on there. So that's definitely worth checking out. It's free. I've done other videos on this, but worth keeping an eye on. And as I say, it's free. So you know, you can get some really cool tones from some of that stuff. It's all capture based, which is not my favorite kind of way to interact with creating guitar tones, but still I think there's some really good sounding stuff, particularly the Dirty Shirley. S Gear is a thing that a chap called Mike Scuffham S Gear, he used to work for Marshall. He's actually put together a really sensible collection of amps. Essentially, you've got like Fender tones, Dumble tones, Mesa Boogie tones, and that sort of stuff. It covers really well the clean to kind of high gain-ish type stuff, and I think that's an area where maybe, for instance, Neural don't cover so many of these areas. It's really low on effects, and for, you know, if, yeah, that's one downside of it. So you've got, I think, now a compressor and a clon, but there isn't a ton of choice in terms of effects. But in terms of amp modeling, it's fantastic, and in terms of aliasing performance, it's fantastic as well. I think 8 times oversampling, which is kind of better than what Neural do as well. So Scuffham S Gear would be one. People told me to try it out for ages, and I think it sounds really good, worth checking out, and you can cover kind of the Fender tweed tones, Dumble tones, Mesa Boogie tones, and that sort of stuff really quite well, in a way that quite a lot of the Neural DSP stuff doesn't really cover, you know, some of those bases, particularly like the edge of breakup-y type stuff. So that might be worth it, particularly for folks that are interested in more vintagey gear. One that I've recently found was MixWave Creamer, and again, in terms of kind of Fender clean sounds, this is not necessarily an area that a Neural DSP covers super well, and spring reverbs and harmonic trems particularly are the things that stand out to me from the MixWave Creamer. They did, since seeing that video, send me a free version of it and the Benson things to check out, so I may do that at some point. The Benson amps thing as well has a fuzz with changeable impedance, so I'm going to check that out at some point. But MixWave stuff, again, 8 times oversampling is an option on that, which basically means as you up the drive, things are going to stay cleaner, more together, and hopefully you get less aliasing, which if you're particularly sensitive to, you might hear, particularly if you used a fuzz into an amp or something like that. So that's a benefit. So the MixWave Creamer, maybe the MixWave Benson, if you let me know in the comments if you tried that out. I hear really good things about that. And the Milkman Creamer, I really thought that was incredible for clean tones. And it's an area that Neural don't particularly service hugely well. There's not like a great amount of choice in terms of clean tones. You've got the Tone King Imperial and you've got Corey Wong stuff, but something that does like a convincing spring reverb. The Creamer has, I think, the best spring reverb I've ever heard in the digital space, except for maybe the Universal Audio Dream 65. Talking of Universal Audio, the person that programmed the Fuchs ODS plugin for them started Nembrini Audio, Igor his name is, and I think Nembrini is worth checking out a bunch of their stuff. They're doing quite a lot of stuff in this space. I don't love the idea of subscription-based plugin stuff personally. I think STL Tones is one of the people that have approached me to do kind of demos, and it just to me feels like I wouldn't want to be personally paying monthly for access to plugins. Personally, I feel like buying once, and I don't know, it seems fairer to me than a subscription-based thing. Could get quite expensive quite quickly. So for that reason, I've kind of, and I don't think they offered me any money anyway, but I decided I'm not really interested in helping you promote a thing like this. One that I think is super underrated is Helix Native. Now, obviously, I'm a massive Helix fan, and I use the HX Stomp and Helix all the time. I don't see Helix Native getting a load of love within this space. If you compare it to Neural DSP stuff, generally what I find is that the Helix Native stuff is way quieter for whatever reason. Once you bring things up to the same volume, I think it's easier to make a fairer comparison. And personally, I've been able to dial in tones that I prefer to Neural DSP most of the time with Helix Native as a user of it. But I do think that if you pull them up side by side, you will find that the Helix Native stuff is quieter, and generally that will cause you to favor the Neural DSP stuff anyway. It's just the way that the mind and ears work. But that's something that I would kind of, the Helix Native I think is the best value plugin you can get for guitar. It's got, you know, all of the amps, effects, delays, reverbs that you can find in the actual Helix, and it covers basically all bases. You've got things like the PV invective in there if you're a high gainer. You've got vintage Fenders in there, vintage Voxes. You've got Dumble clones now. You've got a whole range of amps. You could do basically anything with Helix Native. I think the slight downside versus something like Neural DSP is that the interface is not so slick and a little bit more complicated to build presets on it. I think the oversampling is better, so less aliasing than Neural DSP as well. So if you're into heavier stuff, you may or may not notice this. I don't notice it, but I do know that behind the scenes those things are true. So Helix Native, and also another area kind of parallel to that doesn't get loads of attention, the Line 6 Metallurgy collection, where they had these 3 suites of basically plug-in friendly versions of these Helix Native type amps, where it's kind of more of a workflow similar to Neural DSP or any of the other kind of plug-in manufacturers, where you've got, you know, skeuomorphic designs, you've got the pedals, you've got amps, you've got like this fixed signal flow, and some people really like the way that you can interface with that. But I think those would be my picks really. So S Gear, MixWave, a recent discovery of mine thanks to Jake. We saw an Instagram video where it sounded just incredible, and playing it myself as well just is really good. Let me know if you've tried that. And MixWave Benson, let me know if you've tried that. That I think people really like. The Helix Native stuff is as good as it gets in terms of value, and I think incredible tones to be had there, as well as a big community of users. So that's kind of a thing that some of these other plugins don't really have so much. Maybe the Line 6 Metallurgy collection, but that's not as good value, I don't think, as the Helix Native. So I think that might deserve its own video, Helix Native. I haven't looked at it again for a while, but as well as having the kind of stuff that everything else has, if you put them all together, Helix Native basically covers all that ground. You've also got incredible reverbs and delays, and way more flexibility than any of the other plugins. You know, you can run dual amps, you can run quad amps, you can run all of this stuff in Helix Native. You can do way more complicated things. I guess notable mentions, things like Amplitude. I don't know if people out there are enjoying that stuff still. And then you've got some subscription-based stuff. But let me know in the comments if there are things that I missed. I tried out Clairvoyant, which was from the Modern Metal Songwriters guys. That sounded really good to me and felt really good to play for heavier stuff, so that might be worth looking at. But yeah, the plugin space I think is quite interesting. I think Neural DSP have kind of opened it up quite in a nice way, and I think it's worth at least having 1 or 2 Neural DSP plugins. I think they're really cool, but I think it's also good to, if you're a guitarist and you're looking for versatility, you might want to look outside of Neural DSP for some of these other types of things that can cover a few more bases. Let me know your favorite plugins in the comments below if you're a plugin person. Oh yeah, and Tonex as well. That's got some I really like the Dumble stuff from Joe Bonamassa on Tonex. Forgot to mention that, but that's really cool too. So maybe IK Multimedia, as well as Amplitude, they've got the Tonex thing, which could go on to do really interesting things. So yeah.